Hey everyone, welcome. We're so glad you're here today. Today, we're talking about something that I think every nonprofit, association, and mission driven team has experienced at some point, that moment when the team just feels a little off. So, it's not fully broken necessarily. It might not be dramatic, but the energy can feel weird. The meetings are heavier. People might not just be as honest. And you can tell something is sitting under the surface. And I think this is such an important conversation because nonprofit teams are often moving so fast. We're trying to serve communities, meet deadlines, report to the board, and somehow keep that culture healthy, which is just another thing to the list. But when we don't pause to name what's actually happening inside the team, it starts to affect everything. That's why I'm really excited to have Andreas Marquez-Lara from You Facilitate joining us today to discuss when your team feels off, how to name it, diagnose it, and fix it. But before we dive in, I want to share a couple of quick housekeeping notes. This is meant to feel like a real conversation, so please use the chat as we go. Drop your questions in that Q&A, and we'll try to weave them in as many as possible throughout the whole conversation. There's no pressure to share anything too personal, but if something resonates, please feel free to name it or dive deeper into that comment section. And as always, this is a generous space. We're here to learn, not judge anyone's team dynamics from one sentence in that chat. So please be kind. So let's keep this simple. We're here to see what's actually working, what's not, and hopefully give you a few things to try along the way. So today, we'll kick it off to Andres, and he'll share a short learning segment. Then we'll have some of the curated questions that people asked during the actual registration process, and then we'll open the floor to questions. And before we dive in, I just want to give a quick intro and bio for Andreas. So welcome, Andreas. Really excited to have you here. So Andreas is part therapist, part improv actor, and part community organizer, which honestly feels like the perfect mix for today's conversation. He's spent 2 decades working with nonprofit leaders and teams in moments where something feels stuck, unclear, or misaligned. From smaller NGOs finding their footing to large institutions helping navigate complex changes. He's the founder and CEO of You Facilitate, which is a global network of 210 plus facilitators across 40 plus countries. And he teaches leadership and collaboration at Georgetown University and George Washington University. He also has created the misalignment meter, which we'll share later on in the combo, and practical tools for leaders who know something feels off but need help naming what's actually going on before jumping into fix it mode. So Andreas, welcome. I'm so glad you're here, and I'll hand the floor over to you.
Thank you so much, Nicole, and thank you for the opportunity to be here and present on something that, it's been part of my life for a long time now. And it's funny, when I studied, became a therapist, I never imagined that those skills and those practices would actually be very applicable to the world of organizations and the business world and companies and nonprofits. And here I am, living in a world where, it's the messy human stuff that often gets in the way of people collaborating, of achieving their goals, et cetera. So it's been nice and kind of interesting journey to kind of discover that along the way. So as you mentioned, today's talk, I'm going to briefly talk about a high-level presentation, and then I really want to get into your questions and the AMA. But oftentimes, in the current climate that we're living in, it's very things are moving too quickly, and oftentimes the last thing we pay attention to are the people. You feel it in your body because we are biological creatures, as Jill Bolte-Taylor says in a TED Talk called "My Stroke of Genius." So she's a neurologist that basically had a stroke, and she describes this. And in her talk, the one insight that just really stuck with me is that she says, we tend to think of ourselves as thinking creatures that feel, but biologically speaking, we are feeling creatures that think, right? Our primary mode of engaging the world is a feeling function. So in your day-to-day, as you're putting out fires, like logically, rationally, you might know what's going on, but your body feels things. You have emotional, physical reactions to different things that are happening. And that's your radar telling you, hey, something's going on here. And so sometimes when you're working with your team, something feels off, right? You can't name it sometimes. But the idea is let's start actually naming these things. Let's start identifying what could these things be, so that we can start actually addressing it to the extent that it's possible, knowing that it's not always possible. So my hope is to give you kind of at a high level, just one framework that I found helpful in helping kind of identify when things are a bit off. That can kind of bring more that the rational mindset, the integration between the mind and the heart, right? One framework that was called the grouping model. Then we'll actually have a scenario that one of you, or hopefully you're here, she sent over as a kind of a scenario that we could talk about. So we're going to be going through the grouping model through that scenario. And then again, just open AMA for all of you. So yeah, at this point, Nicole, next slide, please. So yeah, so just some stats and high level numbers, right? So, people tend to think, well, this is just like people feeling whatever. It actually has an impact on the productivity. For those of you that are CFOs or EDs, always thinking about the bottom line and the budgets, like this messy human stuff, the cultural elements has a big impact on the organization, right? So first of all, 85% of employees experience some form of workplace conflict. So the majority, because being humans means that there's going to be conflict. The challenge is how do you deal with the conflict, right? 95% of nonprofit leaders cite staff burnout as a concern. I don't think I have to tell you that. I think many of you are probably living it personally, or you're seeing it with your staff. It's a very difficult time to be in the space. Almost 3 hours is the average employee spends each week just managing conflict. If you're a manager, you supervise people, you're probably having to navigate and manage different human situations that take a emotional toll on you, and then that impacts your productivity and your ability to do the work, which is, again, why we're here in this the nonprofit sector. And 65% of performance issues stem from strained relationships, not skills, right? We're just finishing a project with a mid-sized nonprofit in the East Coast that, basically this 5 senior leadership team was just having such a difficult time talking to each other that it was just like draining them of their ability to actually do what they do in the world. Like they're there to serve a particular population, and they couldn't do that because, or they were doing that, but that was like almost like the side thing. They were just so enmeshed in their conflict. So there's something that has a huge impact on our ability to sustainably do this work and do it well. Next slide, please. So one of the things that often happens, though, it's, when these things feel off, like, it's just like, is it personality? Is it me? Is it them? Is it perhaps something about the process? So it's just helpful to kind of break down that sometimes when something feels off, you can start thinking about what are some of the ways that you can actually identify in which category it fits, right? Because oftentimes, well, this person's this way, he's stubborn, he doesn't listen, or she's, XYZ, whatever it is, people tend to just go straight for the personality. And that's kind of usually the diagnosis. Is this person, they're difficult to work with, they're stubborn, they've been here for 20 years, they do things the same way all the time, they're not open to change. Or maybe you have a Gen Z or millennial working for you, like, oh, they're all about trying new things all the time, they can't stay in one job for 2 years, whatever it is, right? So oftentimes, we assume it's a person, but it's not always the case, right? So when you think about the people problem is perhaps, sometimes you have repeated personal clashes, there's a lack of trust, something has been broken. In those moments, what can help, and I'm sure many of you have done this, is having those one-on-one conversations. It's coaching, is realigning. There's a model which we won't talk about today. That's another conversation, but it's called, Patrick Lencioni is an author, has a book called The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. And essentially he talks about the fact that before you can have conflict, you got to have trust. If you have trust, then you can have conflict, then you can hold people accountable, and then you can basically achieve your goals, more or less, right? But the key thing is that you have to build trust. And so when there's people problems, one of the things I always talk about is like, go back to trust. People try to fix the problem or focus on what's not working. Focus on just building a relationship. Who is this person that's at work? Maybe you both have kids. Maybe you both have cats. Maybe you love, anime, whatever it is. The point is we have to find other points of connection that will help us build a trust so we can then begin to have those difficult conversations later on. But sometimes it's not the person, right? Sometimes it's the process. Decisions are unclear. The roles overlap. People are working in cross purposes. So at that point, it's really important to clarify decisions and redesign the workflow so that can help. And the next, when the model we'll talk about will also kind of give you a kind of easy way to remember all these things. And the last thing, it can be a leadership problem, right? And there's often times where, again, Patrick Lencioni talks about this, that the most important thing that a leadership team can do is first align to make sure they're aligned on their priorities, their goals, their processes, et cetera, and then communicate. It's like this little basically visual where he says just align, and then you have to be transparent and communicate constantly. And so sometimes if there's misalignment at the leadership level, that trickles down into roles, processes, and that can then exacerbate any interpersonal tensions that may exist. So again, just to help you start thinking that when something feels off, start thinking about these buckets, right? People, process, leadership. That's at a high level. But let's get into a framework so you can actually have a framework, and we'll go into an example for that. Let's go to the next slide, please, Nicole. So the GRIPPY model is it's been around for a while, but it's a model that's used in organizational development to help organizations and teams diagnose and assess where are things off, right? And it's very simple, right? Essentially, you're looking at the goals, you're looking at the roles, you're looking at the processes, and you're looking at the interpersonal dynamics. And again, as I mentioned many, many times before, the first thing that we go to is the person, is the conflict, the tension, the person doesn't know what they're doing, et cetera. And we just assume it's them. But the very first thing we have to start is the goals. Are we all working towards the same thing? Are we clear on the number one priority that's helping us move forward? And this is oftentimes the place where we need to start, but it's the least looked environment. We're always looking at the other things, but we should always start with the goal. So if the goal is clear, great. Now let's move to roles. Do people know what their role is to help achieve that collective goal? Maybe that there's lack of clarity and that doesn't help. So I know, for example, we were working with another nonprofit a few years ago where the goal was clear, but the challenge is who makes decisions, who decides what and where, and so in this case, the ED was really, how shall we say it, very adamant that it was her way. She had to decide basically almost everything, which made it very difficult and challenging for other senior leaders to then make decisions and be able to participate, right? And the thing is, it's okay. I mean, the ED can choose their leadership style, but then they have to communicate to their senior leadership team about how decisions get made. Because maybe some decisions, hey, are just for the ED and they just want input from the other senior leaders. Great. Then the senior leaders know that for this particular situation, anything to do with the board, I'll give input, but I know that the ED will go and talk to them directly, and that's their decision. Whatever they say, that's fine. But if there's something around programs that perhaps you're leading, and like you want to be able to make decisions around that, how does that mix with the ED's desire to get involved or not? So this is where having that clarity of roles, who decides what, when are they decided, how is it decided, that's a part that's also very key. And again, when the roles are not clear, that can then lead to tension and conflict, and that kind of something's off. If the goals are clear and the rules are clear, but the processes are not, right? That's a little more challenging then, right? So I am confused here, the roles and processes, but essentially like the decision process about what is the flow in which we act together. So I'm the program officer for a particular division. Okay, that's clear and that's my role. But then how do I decide that downstream? And how do my managers engage with the staff, the frontline staff, et cetera? And again, those decisions and having clear the roles and the decision-making process, if that's clear, that's going to make it less likely to have tension and conflict than if those things are muddled, right? And then if you have all those things clear, the goals, the roles, the processes, and there's still issues, yes, that's where perhaps there's an element, there's the lack of trust, there's a history, maybe there's some trauma, there's somebody perhaps that, something happened and that there's the trust was broken, and then, it can lead to more tension in the space. But this particular framework, the GRIPPY model, again, like the one I just shared before a little bit, again, this one I really want to like the takeaway, if you will, that when something feels off, start asking yourself, is this something like, is it our goals? Are we clear on the goals? Or is it maybe the roles are not clear? Maybe you have too many hats, especially if you're at a small nonprofit, you might wear multiple hats, which is totally fine. But is that clear to you and everyone else? And then within that, how do I make decisions in different environments? And what is the process through which we decide to work to do different things in different moments, right? And then the last thing you can look at is, okay, is the personal elements. Okay, well then how do we build the psychological safety? How do we build the ability to trust each other so we can have conflict in a healthy manner? Next slide, please. So with this said, I want to bring up a scenario that was shared by one of the participants, and thank you for, the person that did. She's the COO of a small nonprofit. They're a 4-person team. She's been in the new role for about 11 months, but after being here for about almost 4 years. And there happens to be a former leadership director level peer who now is only working about 200 hours a year, very, very part-time, very part-time. And they report directly to the CEO. The thing is also this person, the COO and the part-time person, the former director level person, they know each other. They have a friendship since 2019, and like they're the only connection to the rest of the organization. A lot of things have shifted since then. Since they came back in 2024, there was a change in leadership. The role became more peripheral and more invisible. And they only come in basically on Fridays, so they're not there that frequently. So there's almost like it almost feels like he's an appendage to the organization, like historical kind of remembrance of what used to be. But yet he clearly still there. There is supposedly a role for him to play. But this kind of, as the person said, creates like a two-tier system dynamic where just it's affecting cohesion, right? It's not one team, it's like one team plus something. It doesn't quite feel the unity of that. Now, the person hasn't addressed it directly. She's been working around it, but it's beginning to wear on her and the team. Now, unfortunately, I had a bunch of follow-up questions when I got this email. And so like, I want to, if we had more time and I could speak to this person, I would want to know more about like, what is the actual impact this is having on her and the team? That wasn't quite clear from the scenario, but that I would want to drill down a lot more on that. But given what the information we had, I went with this and made some assumptions, which I'll go about next, right? The next slide. So her questions were basically, how do I approach this thoughtfully when he doesn't report to me? He reports to the CEO, not her, where there's no formal authority to act on it directly. And this is very common in nonprofits, especially smaller to mid-size, where perhaps you have informal authority across some different groups, but you don't have the dotted line. You don't have the formal line that says that you can kind of formalize decisions around that, right? And hopefully by now, that we should kind of begin to point to the fact that we're now thinking about roles and processes a little bit, right? If there's like the formal role and the informal role, there begins to create some confusion. So there's a question about like, how do I approach this if I don't have the formal authority to really kind of engage this directly? So that's a question mark that you already are seeing that the role starts to kind of come out, right? How do I navigate this given our personal history? Years of collaboration, joint presentations, shared sheets on the statewide and local association board. So there's an element there that, again, she feels that she has a relationship with this person, but perhaps not the formal authority to address it with him and or the CEO, right? How do I raise concerns that this isn't about performance? He's excellent at the work, but more about cultural presence and team cohesion. A much harder thing to articulate or justify. Again, something feels off, something feels not aligned, and it's not about the work, right? But it's something there. And so this is, again, why we're using this as an example. And where do I even start naming this? And who else needs to be part of this conversation, given that, the CEO, him, or both? So the next slide, please. So essentially, a lot of this, for me, kind of using the grippy lens, I kind of went through this, and my sense was, and again, I'm making assumptions here, but it seems like the goal is somewhat unclear if he's fully bought into the team's current direction and priorities post-transition. He went on a sabbatical in 2024. He came back. His hours got reduced drastically. It's almost like 20 hours, 15 hours a month, maybe so he's not there day to day. If he does come in, it's on Friday. So it's unclear if he is aligned with the goals of the organization, given that that's where she's feeling the things that are off, right? So that's one place I would start. Like, how aligned is he with the overall vision and goals of the organization, with the new leadership, et cetera? Because everything else stems from that. Then the roles. His reporting line, reduced hours, and project scope shifted, but it's unclear how these were negotiated with him or communicated to the team, right? So to me, there's a sense of like lack of clarity into, okay, so he's good at what he does, and there's a role for him, but what is that role, and how is that related to the rest of the team? How does the team relate to the role that he plays? Do they see the value in that? Does he see the value that they play in what he's doing? Because again, when you're a team, it's different roles coming together towards an aligned goal. But if there's not clarity on the goals, if you don't see how your roles are complementing each other, then you begin to have some issues around that. So that feeling that, hey, the cohesion, that can begin to feel off. Because I have some part-time workers in my organization, and that, they don't come in like 5 hours a week maybe, but we have a team cohesion because everyone's clear on like our goals and how these roles are really important in the different parts of the business. So that's another part I would start looking at that for that. Now, process, again, this it's downstream from goals and roles. So maybe it's like, the meeting cadence, the workflow integration. But again, this is because perhaps there's a lack of clarity in the roles and lack of at least clarity on the alignment on the goals. And then perhaps interpersonal, there's the heaviness that she feels because she's known them since 2019. They went through a pandemic together. There's a lot of elements here that she feels for this, and she has a relationship perhaps to talk to him, but I don't think she feels she doesn't have the formal authority, and she's questioning, like, do I have the role to intervene here? How do I do this? And so for me, the question we would start here is, and obviously I'll preface this by saying there's a lot of unknown variables in this scenario that I want to clarify a little more. I want to know more about, for example, what is the relationship with the CEO with this person? How do they get along? What is the relationship with this other person, with the other staff member? Are there other tensions? Does he have other close connections or professionally within the group? Is how aligned is he with the goals? So there's questions to unpack a little more. But one thing I would say and suggest is perhaps is for the person that wrote this, the COO, the Chief Operating Program Officer, to bring this up with the CEO and just say, hey, I'm noticing there has elements of, perhaps I'm noticing the impact of what you're seeing, basically. What is the impact that you're seeing on the team dynamics? And what is the CEO's perception of that? Because they may say, oh, no, I think everything's fine. And that's a data point for you. Or they may say, you know what, I've been noticing that as well. Like, I think maybe there's something off here where perhaps, and again, it's to unpack. But I would just start with just curiosity. How do others perceive the situation? And how do they name the impact? Because that's going to give you more data to then start having conversations using your relationship with people to understand this. Talking to the CEO, talking to your friend to understand, hey, how do you see this? If you have the kind of relationship with him, say, hey, let's have a virtual lunch together. I'll meet you in your office on Friday. Let's have lunch and just talk about how are things going? Here's what I'm noticing. What are you noticing? But I think that this is just a starting point. There's no solution to be had at this point. I think the solution, the first step to finding a solution would be getting more data around the clarity in terms of is there alignment on goals? What is the perception they have around their roles? And then just also trust factor. I know this is the one of the things I mentioned earlier with the Patrick Lencioni, what is the trust factor level here? My sense is that there might be a lack of trust from him to the rest of the organization. And if that's the case, well, what can he do, right? But this is, by the way, this is why this job is so difficult, because you're managing these interpersonal dynamics at the nonprofit while also trying to do the work that's serving the people you do work with, right? So that double layer. But oftentimes, if we don't address it, it compounds and it gets worse. And then people get burned out, people leave. And so we're trying to do that before that. So at this point, I'm going to go to the next slide, Nicole. And then I think we're just going to open it to, I want to leave you with another just very concrete practice, though, that you could do. So before we open to the AMA, which essentially would be, here's an activity you can do in any future meeting that is just focused on the goals. And it can be, for example, if the person that wrote the scenario, if you before you even wanted to approach the CEO or your friend or your colleague, whatever, you could facilitate at your next meeting, have a conversation, say, hey, let's do a brief activity just to make sure we get alignment on the goal clarity here, or have the CEO do this. But you essentially at any meeting where the leader can basically invite their senior leadership team to say, hey, I want to check in on how aligned we are with the goals. And let's basically talk about, just frame it up. I went to a webinar, it's really important for us to be aligned on goals, whatever it is. Frame it so just to focus on the goals. Then ask people to just write on a Google document anonymously or on paper, what is the number one priority, right, that we have for this quarter or for this project or for this year? And just leave it blank and let them write the top priority or the top two, whatever you want. Then collect that information. And then as you read it aloud, begin to cluster the different perceptions. Ideally, you're all aligned and you have the same response or versions of that. But if you begin to notice that people have different perceptions of what the top priority is, that's wonderful. This is wonderful data to say, oh, wow, interesting. And then let's begin to unpack tell me more. How did this become why is this more important for you than others? But the point is, you're making something invisible visible. You're making these priorities that people are working and operating from something that perhaps is implied into making it explicit, because once it's explicit, then you can work on it. And that's kind of the whole premise around this. Next slide. And the last thing I'll say here, basically, the point of this is that when there's misalignment, oftentimes is because people are not being explicit about where there is or there isn't alignment. Next slide, please, Nicole. And so well, the last thing I'll leave you before we go into the AMA for the remainder of the time is that we have this tool called the misalignment meter that's free for you to use. We'll put the link in the chat. We'll send it in the follow-up correspondence as well. That is like a brief link that you can take, and I'll give you basically your perception of how aligned your team is or not. And then it gives you some clarifying questions you can ask you and your teams to get more alignment around that. Because again, at the end of the day, this is about making things that are implicit, explicit, so you can then actually address them. Because if you don't address them, they just compound and get worse over time. So with that, I'll pause, bring back Nicole, and then we'll open up to your questions you may have.
That was great, Andreas. I think there is a lot that you shared that is useful, helpful, but also it's a lot to think about in the sense of, it's not always just fixing the people. And that is, I think, where a lot of people initially go. There's a lot to consider behind the scenes around communication, processes, leadership. And I think starting there is so important. So I just appreciate you naming those so clearly and providing a few examples. And thank you to the person who shared that scenario. That was a really helpful exercise to do. So thank you to all. I am going to pull in a few questions that came through during registration. We had some pretty consistent themes across. So I'm hoping that we can dive into some of those questions. So the first one is, when a team feels off, what are some of the early signs leaders should pay attention to? And I know you've kind of touched on that, but I was hoping you could dive a little deeper into some of those things.
Yeah, I mean, this is very subjective, right? I mean, Peter, who put in the chat, how do you address this when the ED refuses to see there's a problem or listen to the issue? Like he clearly saying something's off, but the ED isn't. So first, the starting point is to just acknowledge the fact that when something feels off, it's first your subjective experience. Something feels off here, and it's to say, hey, it's my hypothesis. Something's off here. But now you have to go get data, right? And that's what I'm talking about. Now you have to go have conversations. Now you have to go observe. Where's this coming from? What's making me feel this way? And again, the gripping model can be one of these tools to help you identify. Is it off because maybe I'm behaving towards one goal, but my team's in a different goal? Is that why it feels off? Or is it perhaps that I'm doing the work that my colleague's doing, and now we're fighting about who's doing what? Or is it maybe about who gets to decide about the program direction or whatever it is? So you begin to identify, where is this off feeling coming from? And you begin to validate and build your hypothesis as to why it's one thing versus the other. And again, I think this is something in terms of early signs. The earliest sign is just your somatic experience. Something feels off. Something feels in your body emotionally. You feel tired, you feel tense, you feel stressed, you feel anxious. And I think in those moments, that's the first flag. Say, okay, let's take a step back and let's zoom out and say, okay, first of all, remember that it's probably not as important as you think it is. First off, you are so committed to the work. We're so passion-driven creatures, especially in the nonprofit space. You're there because you care about people. You're there because you want to help people or animals or the planet, right? But the point is, your passion is there. And we get so consumed by it's why can't you see it? Why people can't see that climate change is real and we got to take these actions? Or why can't you see whatever it is happening, right? That intensity is such a powerful tool. But that's fire, and that fire can burn us. So the first thing is, when you notice something's off, is okay, let's zoom out a little bit. Remember, it's not a life and death situation. Most things are not. I'm sure in some of your cases, you are frontline workers working with people that are, have mental illness or suicide prevention, and it is life and death. But I would venture to say that most of the time, it's not that this moment I need to act. So zooming out and then kind of thinking, okay, where's this coming from? Where can I get more data? Let me get more information, right? One of the things that often, there's a great author, her name is Donna Meadows. She was one of the mothers, if you will, of the systems change movement. And she says, before you create any kind of change in the system, because essentially when you feel something off, you want to change it. You don't want that. You want to create some change. The first, she says, before you try to create any change, get the beat of the system. Get the beat. There's a rhythm to any system in your organization. There's a rhythm. What is it? And you begin to observe it and your part in that system as well. So I think that would be kind of my first answer to that. And tying it to Peter's question about, okay, well, in this specific case where the ED does not see the problem or listen to the issues, I would just be very curious. What do they see? What does the ED see because clearly you're not seeing what you're seeing, but what are they seeing? and then trying to understand their perspective. It's really getting in their shoes, before trying to kind of present your argument and your reasoning for it. Really try to understand, get the beat of the system, like from their perspective, him or her, right? What are they seeing? Why do you think they're perhaps minimizing what you're seeing? They're not seeing it the same way. What are the other variables, right? Again, it may not just be them. They also so we were working with a nonprofit recently, as I mentioned this, and there's a lot of tension happening between the senior leadership team and the ED. The ED sees it a particular way, the senior leadership sees it differently. But what the senior leadership team perhaps is not seeing is the amount of pressure that the board's putting on the ED to make certain changes, right? And so there may be an invisible factor there that perhaps the senior leadership is not seeing so much because the ED is trying to protect the rest of the team, right? And so that itself could be a variable. Again, not without knowing more specifics, but I would just say, be curious, try to find out more about their perspective. What's keeping them up at night, and why are they seeing it that way? And then the other thing we'll do is, clearly if you see a problem, document what is the impact of this problem. What is the impact that you're seeing on the day-to-day, in the organizational level, in the bottom line, in the care service, or whatever it is, to just kind of begin to build that case, and then find allies. Who else sees the problem like you do, and who else doesn't see it like you do? But again, all this information is going to help you just continue to build the case and evidence for you to just have a conversation. Because again, at the end of the day, it may not be your way or their way. There might be a third way. And oftentimes I feel like what's important is we're so caught up in our perception of the truth that I'm trying to convince Nicole that, hey, this is not a Zoom chat. This is StreamYard, and therefore it should be XYZ. And well, no, she's been doing it differently. The point is, we have different perspectives. And if the more I'm trying to convince each other of it, we're just going to bang heads. So instead of just trying to convince each other, being curious, really trying to understand where they're coming from, and trying to see the systems, zooming out so you can see, okay, well, what else is going on? Who are the other actors? What are the other influences and incentives that are keeping us in this particular situation? That's going to make it more likely for something to shift a little bit than trying to just convince them, because clearly, they're not being convinced as is. Otherwise, you wouldn't be asking this question.
I'm curious though, how do you create a container for that? So there's a lot of leaders that don't really potentially like that feedback, or some of those questions that you're asking are really can be bold for some people to feel comfortable asking those questions, or they might not even have a leadership position. How do you create a container where people feel safe or comfortable to ask those questions?
So this is where I talk about, again, as you're talking and having conversations with different people and you're getting data, you're mapping your system. So maybe you and I see eye to eye in this situation, or maybe Tasha doesn't, right? Or maybe Peter doesn't either. But now I'm getting more information that, hey, maybe it ends up being that in a senior leadership team, when you have 7 out of 10 people seeing it one way, but the ED doesn't, that's important data. If the majority of the senior leadership team agrees and is aligned on something, and they perhaps feel that this is something that should be done, in that small group of people, there can be okay, what is the best way that we can approach the other team members to think about that? But you have to find your allies, and you have to understand the terrain in which you're going in, not to convince or, the right way of doing, but really, again, especially in this space, because we're so driven by purpose and impact, what is the impact we're having on the end users, what is the impact we're having on the children we're trying to serve, on the ecosystem we're trying to save, whatever it is, you have to bring it back to that. Because at the end, otherwise it just feels because the thing is, when we care so much about something and we have so much at stake, like with the work that you're doing, we get very passionate and somewhat trying to convince you that if we don't do it this way, then your way's not going to work, and we're going to lose lives or lose UGs. And I think so. Mapping out your system, finding your allies, but also turning down the intensity. I think one of the things I heard this philosopher named Bayo Nicomafelli, I think, a Nigerian philosopher, talk about recently is that in this sector, urgency is part of the problem, right?
Sure.
I'm not saying that things are not urgent and the planet it's crazy right now, but we get organized by urgency, and that actually gets in the way of us actually being able to do the work, because we're so caught up in that. And that kind of gets us into almost like a predisposed situation where I'm going to go and I got to convince you, otherwise somebody's going to die or something's going to happen. So I think mapping the system, zooming out, and just turning down the volume a little bit under urgency, I think all these things can help create the container for that. and also coming from a place of curiosity, really understanding like where are they coming from? What they're not bad people. They just have different perspectives. Like, why are they so passionate? What? And sorry, the last thing I'll say is just there's so many things, right? Is identity. Is we get so caught up in like this is who I am as a person, like and so the more intensity we feel towards something, it should be a red flag for you. There's something about your identity or ego that's tied to this, right? You have so much you feel at stake. For example, like I like to think I'm a good listener. When my wife tells me I'm not, I get really pissed, because my identity is I'm a trained therapist. I facilitate for a living. Like this is what I do. And the person I love that's closest to me says that I'm not a good listener. Like, what are you talking about? Right. But that just is playing to my ego and identity. And so I think the more we recognize our getting triggered or caught up and like, oh my God, the more it should be oh, wow, there's something here that I'm trying to defend at all costs because it's so important to me. What am I trying to hang on to? Why is it so important for me? So that's just some response to that.
Yeah. And it's important too. Like I'm a huge believer in curiosity, and like I love staying curious and continuing to ask questions and just learning more. But I also think there's something really healthy about debate. And oftentimes, like a healthy debate, like we don't often, and it's not encouraged, it doesn't feel like in society lately, to have discussions where we're allowed to disagree. And maybe because we disagree, we might understand someone else's perspective a little more and come up with a different solution. So I feel like we're just missing healthy debate in a lot of spaces. And this feels like you get to rumble a little bit in those spaces to actually find the better solution. So I have a lot of people ask, go ahead.
I was saying like that point brings me back to Patrick Lencioni around trust. Yep. Conflict is not bad. But you got to have the trust so you can have the healthy conflict, so you can have the debate and the discussion. And it's not about you as a person, but the ideas and the challenges with the intent that we're going to make our ideas stronger through this debate.
So I'm going to jump into a question then just on trust specifically. So what are some low cost practical things leaders can do to start improving team trust and communication right away? That's like an ongoing thread that we've been hearing across the board.
Yeah. I mean, the one thing I say, think about again, trust, basically, there's another framework called trustology. I mean, a lot of these frameworks we'll share with you resources. I wrote a book called Facilitating Leadership, which is based on a class teacher at leadership at Georgetown University. And so the Lencioni framework and the one I'm about to tell you is also there. But I think it's called trustology or something like that. But the premise is that trust basically has three elements. There's, expertise, consistency, and positive regard. And you got to have a basic level at all three to have trust with somebody. Like if Nicole and I met, and supposedly I'm an expert in communication, facilitation, leadership development, but I start saying things that completely feel off, like what the hell are you talking about? Based on everything I know, like something's off, her trust factor will go down, right? If we schedule a meeting and I don't show up or I'm late and I don't say anything, I'm consistently showing up, maybe she forgets me once, but the second time it's like, okay, now I can't, can I really bring Andres to do AMA? Can I trust him to show up on time, be prepared? Trust factor goes down. And the last thing is, positive, like, are people nice? Like, am I frowning? Am I talking to her like this? Or am I smiling? Like there's positive element around that. So to have trust, you got to have all three at a baseline. Mm-hmm. But the one that has the most impact after the baseline is a positive regard. It's being kind, is being curious, is being, all these things. So how do you build trust? What are the low cost practical things? You got three buckets here. Are you showing up with your expertise in a way that people know that, if you are the expert in the program officer around legal advocacy for children, like, are you, like, when people ask you a question, like, are you able to respond in a way that people trust your expertise? Can you cite the references or the case or whatever? That's one way. Are you showing up consistently? People, like, if you say you're going to show up at 12 o'clock, are you there at 12 or are you there at 12:30 or 1 o'clock, or do you cancel every time? And then how are you showing up? Are you criticizing people? Are you coming to a meeting and saying, you got it wrong, you don't know what you're doing, or you're being curious? So again, these are things that I feel that anyone can start doing, and they can be very small on day to day. But again, being kind, being curious, giving people the benefit of the doubt, being consistent, if you say you're gonna do something, do it. Or if you don't, at least explain why not. Follow with people. It may sound simple, but like it really builds the foundation of trust, because if we do that consistently, it compounds over time. Because then, maybe I miss a meeting one time, I completely forgot, but then I built this over months. So now, in general, Andres is trustworthy. It was this situation, his kid was sick or whatever it was, right? So these are some things that you can do. The other thing you can do to build trust is also about the fact what, and I mentioned this earlier, finding points of connection, right?
Mhm.
We tend to focus so much on the professional side of things. And I know that, you don't have to be friends with your colleagues. That's fine, but we are human, and we can't just like take off our personality when we get to work and say, I'm going to be a robot and just do the work. Like if you had a bad day, if your kid's sick, if you had a fight with your partner, if, with the world's happening, any kind of crisis you're having, it's just all that has an impact on us as people, right? And perhaps people just don't know that, hey, people don't know that you had kids. People don't know that you care about the World Cup. Like find other points of connection, because as you find other points of connection, what happens when you imagine if you go to a bar, or if you go to to a network conference, to a conference, and you start talking, and you also like, oh, you're from Canada? No way, me too. We're in Canada. From British Columbia? No way. What? And like the excitement starts to build when you find these connections. Or like, you like parrots? I like parrots, right? Like, and the more niche specific, I know it might be weirder, but the more the connection is there. Like I love, for example, astrology and travel hacking. And like, yeah, I'll say this like as my first pass. Hey, like, what are you into? Astrology and travel hacking. Just to let you know, like, hey, I'm making an invitation. Here's some points of connection that you can tag into, right? And then it's up to you to say, oh, really? You can be curious. Tell me more and unpack that. Or if you happen to have a connection, you can say, oh, no way, me too. And right away. So again, the image I would say is like, think of it as having a radar where you're trying to constantly find connections, and you're constantly putting out invitations to the world saying, oh, I have kids. I like dogs. I like cats. And do so in a way that feels comfortable. Obviously, I'm an extrovert. I'm always an open book to anyone. So, but my wife's a hardcore introvert. So it's a bit difficult. So find something that feels comfortable for you. But the invitation is, to the extent you feel comfortable, make opening invitations, make openings for the world to see you, because then when you get seen, that feels good. It's mutual, and you begin to build connections. And that also, I mean, that's how you make friends too, right?
Absolutely.
So these are just some things that I think apply not just to the workplace, but just in life in general.
I love that. We have a friend at the Nonprofit Hive, Tim Parsons, and he calls it weird bonding, and being able to connect with whatever kind of unique thing that you can like really build a relationship on. So just a fun little thing for you. I do have one other question. I know we're getting to time here, but several people ask specifically about leadership and management skills as a challenge. So I'm curious, what skills matter most when you're trying to support a team through tension or disconnection?
The number one skill you need to do that is doing the inner work and increasing your emotional intelligence. That's the foundation. Doesn't matter how many books you read on Patrick Lencioni, and it doesn't matter how many webinars you've gone to listen to somebody speak about whatever grippy framework, or it doesn't matter. If you haven't, you have to do the work. You have to go to therapy, work with a coach, do the journaling, meditate, identify what are the things that trigger you about whatever situation you're dealing with. Because if you're a manager and you're not able to abstract yourself to be able to engage the situation, you're going to be, again, triggered. You're going to be stuck in there. You're going to be fighting to defend your point of view and not be able to hold the container for something new to emerge. That's the baseline. Like I would say, like that's the number one thing that you have to focus on. Once you do those, like once you do the inner work and you're able to identify, oh, wow, like I can see why when I talk to Nicole about this, I get very upset. Like once you have that clarity, then if she was to say that, I won't be as upset if I've done the inner work, right? But if you haven't, doesn't matter how many books you read. The moment that Nicole says something to me, I get angry. I'm triggered now. My brain now is in a different mindset, and I'm trying to defend myself. I'm trying to convince her. I'm trying to like react. And so I lost that situation. So doing the inner work. The other thing I would say is also just embracing Walt Whitman, an American poet, said, I am large, I contain multitudes. It's also acknowledging that we can have multiple points of view about one thing. We can have polarities inside of all of us. Maybe I agree with you, Nicole, on this, but I also disagree with, and I have a tension. So the inner work will help you accept and recognize when you're triggered, but will also help you accept the inner tension that you have about different things. Gosh, wouldn't it be easier to just kind of like have the bad people and the good people, and we're all the good people, everybody else is the bad people, and we have to no, like we all have the good and the bad. We all have the things that help us and the things that hurt us. but it's wholly accepting and embracing our own inner polarity. That's going to also allow you to have distance so you can then engage in a way and have conversation and be curious and be kind and all these things. Because if you're in it and you're just basically, triggered, you're not going to be able to zoom out and you're going to intensify the tension. So that's kind of like the one basic thing I would say.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I find even in movements or within teams, there we are allowed to have different opinions in different spaces. Like we all might agree on this one thing, but we all bring our own intersection to how we were raised, where we live. Like if we don't have those, like again, it's like that healthy debater, like healthy lived experiences. Like as long as you're not a bad person, that doesn't mean you can't do this work with me, even though we don't agree on everything. And I find I'm seeing movements kind of fall apart in that space because if we're not fully aligned on all of these things, then all of a sudden we can't do this together. And I just feel like that I've seen movements fall because of stuff like that, and it doesn't need to be that way.
Yeah. Well, and going back, like it takes. I know we're ending, but just like the thing is, like it's hard. The reason why we do this is because it's easier to go into your echo chamber than to create a diverse, because it takes a lot of work. And so that's why I also think it's happening. But this is again why we're leaders, why you're here. The work as leaders is not easy. And I think it starts with the inner work.
Andreas, that was lovely. Thank you so much for that conversation. I know we didn't get to dive into nearly as many questions as we had, but I think there was some really good discussion in a lot of spaces and a lot of good resources. So thank you. I will be sure to share the resources that Andreas mentioned in the thank you email following this. And then we're also going to share an article. So we'll be sure to add some of those pieces as well. So again, thank you everyone who joined. Thank you who shared questions for the scenario. It was a great way to help kind of wrap this conversation in the full picture. Andreas, thank you again for bringing such
Thank you, everybody.
thoughtful components to this space. And to anybody who is interested in staying curious about other AMAs, please do check us out and join the Nonprofit Hive. Andreas, thank you. And I look forward to future conversations.
Thank you so much. Be well, everybody.